You're watching Fish Plates and Scratch Builds. I'm Jonathan, and these are my Scratch Build diaries. In this series, I'll take a look at past Scratch Build projects from my 00 gauge layout, Addleford Green. I'll show you step by step how I used raw materials to create realistic scale replicas of both real and fictional buildings. In this episode, we'll be looking at the Stationmaster's house. Whether I'm building a model of a historical building or something completely fictional, every Scratch Build project begins with a little research. It's honestly much more fun than it sounds. Addleford Green is a fictional place, but the layout is based on the Hawkhurst branch, which ran from Paddock Wood to Hawkhurst in Kent. But this wasn't always the plan. I actually had no real focus for my layout, other than it being a country terminus in the southern region. I found this image of Cranbrook Station online, which started something of an obsession, and I knew this is the line that I would model. This Wild Swan book, The Hawkhurst Branch by Brian Hart, was a treasure trove of information. As well as all the photos and personal recollections, there were also some scale drawings of many of the buildings. Basically, the dream for any Scratch builder. But although there were drawings of the station building, goods shed, and lots of other incidental buildings around, there were none of the Stationmaster's house. There was a general floor plan which showed the overall footprint, very handy for determining overall width and length, but not height. This would require some educated guesswork. Time to count some bricks. Yes, really. Luckily, some examples of this building survive to this day, having been converted to private dwellings. Now, I found images online and was able to count the brick courses. Using the size of a standard UK brick, I estimated the height of the building and also took a stab at the angle for the roof pitch. Sometimes you just have to go with what looks right. I'm working in 00 scale, where every real-world foot is 4mm on the model. Using this information, I create a basic template in something like Microsoft Word or Inkscape and print it to the size I need. Now, I stuck this on some mount board I'd bought from my local hobby shop. This is basically thick card used for mounts in picture frames. At the time, I thought this would give the building a nice, solid internal structure. Wait and see how that turns out for me. I decided to use these laser-cut windows from L-Cut Creative. I made sure to test fit them as I cut the window apertures, being sure not to cut away too much at a time. The majority of my buildings are built from embossed plastic sheet, either from Slater's Plastikard or Southeastern Finecast. Their standard sheets are around 0.5mm thick and very easy to cut with a craft knife. The card structure made a handy template. I left the top portion of the front bare, as the real brickwork was covered in a textured rendering and I wanted to use card for this. The real building also had this strip of decorative brickwork dividing the floors. I found this piece on a sprue of Will's building materials, which was a pretty close match. To bring the top floor level with the elements added to the ground floor, I cut another piece of card to fit. Okay, full disclosure, this is where it gets messy. This was my first build for this layout and I was still developing my scratch building techniques, so the following images may cause distress. Look at some of those cut lines. This is one of the reasons I stopped using mount board. I just found it too thick to cut accurately at this scale. Okay. That was a disaster, let's start again. A new set of templates and some fresh Plastikard. Instead of using cardboard as a backing, I used another sheet of plain Plastikard. Laminating 2 layers of plastic using plastic cement makes them much stronger and the bond is quicker too. I cut the windows using this diagonal cutting technique. It helps you to get into the very corners with less chance of overcutting on the vertical and horizontal lines. Don't worry, the apertures on the backing piece don't have to be as accurate. These lintels, cut before adding the backing, look much neater on this run. For the rendering layer, I went with this cereal box. It's much thinner than mount board, much easier to cut, and has a pleasing texture on the inside face. Everything is looking much neater. Don't worry, I've left this section blank for a reason. I'm building a bay window separately to add later. Sadly, it's a feature no one ever sees on this model due to its placement on the layout. At least I know it's there. Here are all the major pieces of the building ready to go. One thing I haven't talked about is how these parts will go together. If I just butt-ended them, they would break the brickwork continuity and look very obviously like layers of card and plastic. By cutting the inner layer just slightly shorter, they can slot together neatly. And this also helps to strengthen the join. It's not perfect because you can still see the edge of the brick layer and see that the mortar doesn't continue. But this is largely hidden after painting, as you'll see. Because the Plastikard structure was quite thin, I had nowhere for the window frames to sit. I had to find a way to suggest a deeper wall structure. My solution was these square plastic rods from evergreen scale models, faced with some very thin strips of brick embossed Plastikard. Using the windows as a guide, I created these frames which would sit on the other side of the wall. Once glued in place, I made sure the outer walls were flush with these brick frames. I repeated this for every single window. I was cursing how many windows this building had by this point, and this is just the front. Another plastic strip, this one much thinner, was used for the window sills. The door was from a Pico building elements pack. The set of French doors on the rear balcony were made using the same strips used for the window sills. Onto the bay window. Now this starts as a template like much of the building, and that becomes a piece of cut Plastikard. I drop this into some hot water to soften the plastic. This makes it much more pliable and easier to bend. The edge of a metal ruler acts as a guide for a nice straight edge. Testing the fit, this looks pretty good. The small sash windows were from the same Pico building elements pack as the door. They were given the same treatment as all the other windows. All of them. Some plastic tabs were added along the top to carry the decorative brickwork strips around the bay window. Painting is a whole new level of learning, and I made a bit of a mess with these. White is a hard colour to get right, especially on a dark background, and I wasn't patient. These days, I'd have started with a grey primer and built up multiple thin layers of white gradually. Adding some deluxe materials glue and glaze to the windows results in a clear, durable film that looks like glazing. I wouldn't use this on every window, but it is a handy tool for very small windows or filling awkward shapes. The time has come to put the walls together. I love this bit. I use these plastic strips as joint strengtheners, but nowadays I would probably use triangles of Plastikard instead for a greater area of coverage and better accuracy in keeping it square. Some more strips along the bottom aid in keeping the building square. Again, I'd probably use other techniques today. This was my first build after all. Adding these roof sections also helped to keep the structure stable. The white piece is embossed corrugated Plastikard. The grey piece is a spare roof element from a plastic kit. The top windows have a layer of weatherboarding, so this was added next. I cut the pieces required for the chimneys. One side was already in place for each as part of the end walls, so it was just a case of constructing the remaining sides so they would hook over the existing walls and appear seamless. You can see the same process of laminating and strengthening throughout this build. I made these internal roof pieces that would add strength and support the roof when it was added. The corbels on these chimneys were made with very thin strips of embossed Plastikard. Care had to be taken to make sure the corner joins looked okay. They're perhaps a little thick overall, but I'm happy with the final result. I made 3 holes in this small piece of plastic to accept some chimney pots formed from the stems of used cotton buds. The mortar around them is just a small amount of air-drying clay smoothed out. I used Das clay. The roof sections are just plain Plastikard, cut to compensate for the chimneys. It's all starting to come together. The front door has this little sentry box style porch. It was cut from some shiplap embossed Plastikard and detailed with plastic strip. I was adding lighting to this building, so I used a can of Halford's black spray paint to coat the interior. Doing this helps to stop bright light from leaking out through the thin plastic. Now this is my absolute favourite part, giving the whole model an overall coat of grey primer. Now this really brings it all together, and it also helps to show imperfections that were harder to see previously. A quick test fit on the layout and we can get an idea of how it's all going to look. I must have gotten a bit excited because I forgot to add these side pieces to the top windows, plus a support bar for the dormer roofs. If I added lighting to a completely hollow building, it'd look a bit odd. I made this foil-lined box to help keep the lighting local to only 1 or 2 rooms. The foil also helps prevent light leakage and should amplify the effect of the LED too. Time to start painting. I start with a liquid wash of a pale acrylic mortar colour. Keeping it quite fluid means it will seep into the mortar lines, exactly what we want. Once the mortar has fully dried, I dry brushed a variety of different shades of brown over the surface, being careful not to get the paint in those recesses. Building up different tones creates a random colour effect, much like real brickwork. I gave the rendering a top coat of pale cream and then added a wash of pale brown to give it a little more colour variation and suggest a bit of weathering. I made up a wash of brown acrylic paint, quite weak, and I washed it over the brickwork. What this does is it helps to tone down some of those colours and stops the brickwork from looking a little over bright and clean. The windows were sprayed with a white primer. The glazing was some clear plastic cut from an item of packaging, cut to size and glued using glue and glaze, which dries crystal clear. Various details were now picked out in appropriate colours such as the windowsills and chimney pots. The door was given a dark green undercoat and a lighter shade of green was dry brushed on top to highlight some of the raised details. Some metallic gold paint on the fittings finishes the look. Proof that the strangest materials can be useful. These net curtains are actually an old wet wipe which had dried out in a poorly sealed packet. Regular curtains can be modelled by adding some coloured paper cut to a recognisable shape. I cut these shapes from plain Plastikard for the dormer window roofs. After a few test runs using Scratchbuilt to get the angle right, this offcut of MDF offered a nice straight edge to guide the gluing process and keep things square. Some plastic strip joined at an angle forms the fascia. The real building has visible rafters under these roofs, so I added these elements, so they appear to peek through on the model too. The dormer roofs were glued in place and the fascia boards painted cream. For the roof tiles, I created this grid in Microsoft Excel. Using a ruler and an old pen, I scored along the long horizontal lines. This creates a subtle indentation in the card that'll be the gap between each tile. I cut the sheet into short strips opposite to the way that I scored them and glued each one on the top of the roof starting from the bottom. I overlap each strip, making sure to offset the tiles. I can also cut away the odd corner to suggest wear and tear. I built this process up until the whole roof was covered. I masked up any areas I wanted to protect and gave the whole roof an undercoat of black paint. You can really see the effect the scoring process has in this photo in bringing out those individual tiles. Using subsequently lighter shades of grey, I dry brushed the roof to further highlight some of that relief detail. Once again, making sure that the darker colour applied first was still able to remain in the gaps and the recesses underneath. The ridge caps were picked out in a terracotta brown. Some dry brushed brown adds a hint of rust to the corrugated iron roof. These fence pieces were modified slightly to fit the balcony above the bay window at the rear. The front porch was glued in place. Guttering and downpipes came from another pack of building elements. They were painted green and added to the front and rear. All that hard work is starting to pay off. One final thing I do before putting the model on the layout is it's given an overall coat of matte sealer or varnish. I use one from Plastikard. You can do this before you've added the glazing, or if you've added the glazing, you can mask it up to make sure it doesn't get covered in the sealer. I usually try to do this before I've added the glazing, but sometimes that's not possible, and it's easy enough to mask up the windows. What this stage does is it helps to unify everything on the model, making sure there's no random areas of gloss or satin paint, and it really helps to bring it all together and make it look like a real building. Once I'm happy with all the details, I can glue the building to the layout. For some extra detail, I created this lattice work which would act as a section of trellis for a climbing rose. I also added this small stone bordered garden out the front and populated it with different plants. And here we are, here's the finished product on the layout in situ on Addleford Green station. I was very happy with the result, and this project remains one of my favourites to this day. I think it's something to do with that original photo that I saw. I've learned lots, but I'm still very proud of the first building to go on Addleford Green. Thanks so much for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and look out for more Scratchbuilt diaries of both past and future projects for when I start my brand new micro 00 gauge layout. Take care and see you in the next one.